Good morning. My name is Greg Gray, and I'm a private lands biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Partners for Fish and Wildlife Program. Today's talk is entitled Implementing Oak Woodland Restoration Projects on Private Lands, a Precursor to Prescribed Burning, Humboldt County, California. Overview of today's talk. First, I'm going to talk about the Partners Program, who we are and what we do, the importance of oak woodlands as islands of biodiversity and wildlife habitat. Conifer encroachment is reducing oak woodlands, which has led to a concerted push to protect oaks among practitioners and landowners and partners. I'm going to provide two project examples of oak woodland restoration that landowners and myself have done. And last, I'm going to talk about oak woodland conservation as a two-tiered approach: woody biomass, conifer removal, and then prescribed burning as the long-term management solution. Here's a map just to show where I work in the Partners Program. Focus on the two tan/orange blobs. Those are primarily Oregon white oak and California black oak woodlands centered around the Van Dusen and Mad River watersheds and the South Fork Eel and Salmon Creek and Mattole and southern Humboldt. So getting back to the Partners Program, it is a cost-share program that works directly with private landowners to implement habitat restoration projects for fish and wildlife. It's aimed at improving wildlife habitat while balancing the needs and objectives of private landowners. And it's important to note that we are a partner, not just the funding agency. We are local biologists. I live in Arcata, then I work with landowners all over Humboldt County and parts of Trinity. When I'm developing oak woodland projects, for instance, I go out there and meet with the landowner many times. We visit potential work units that he or she has decided they want to work on. I evaluate whether they're a good fit for the program. And then once we've come up with mutually achievable objectives, we'll sit down and develop a work plan and a budget and figure out how we can make it happen. And the Partners Program has funding attached to it, so I'll provide a certain amount of cost share. And then the landowner will also provide cost share, which can be in-kind labor, equipment, supplies, oversight, long-term maintenance. It's a very flexible program. Here in the North Coast, our aim is to support working landowners and keep working lands working. And I cannot underscore at this point enough, whether it's industrial timberland, non-industrial timberland, ranch land, these areas are huge swaths of open space without concrete, without hordes of people, without lots of roads. And they support a whole host of migratory birds and mammals and elk and deer and bear and songbirds. And they're about as close to wild open lands as we are going to get when we're talking about oak woodland. Sorry for all the writing on the slide. You can just ignore it and look at the pretty pictures. Why are we prioritizing oak woodland conservation on the North Coast? Oak woodland grassland habitats are the most biodiverse habitat in North America, supporting over 330 species of wildlife, pollinators, and flowering plants. They are islands of biodiversity in a larger conifer matrix. They provide the cavities, the acorns, and complexity that benefit migratory songbirds, kestrels, fisher, elk, and deer. Lots of research has shown that oak woodlands have been declining significantly in California and more broadly across the West Coast, particularly in the Oregon white oak community. One of the primary reasons is conifer encroachment, a result of long-term fire suppression. This slide is to illustrate the importance of oak woodlands to birds. Altman and Stevens' Land Manager Guide to Oak Woodlands and Bird Habitat illustrated that there's 26 oak obligate bird species and a whole host of other migratory birds that depend on oaks as some part of the natural history life cycle, whether it's wintering habitat, breeding habitat, stopover habitat. It's important to note that these birds are highly associated with oaks. They're inextricably linked to oak woodland, so as the oaks go, so do all of these birds. In 2019, you guys may have seen an article was published in the journal Science, which showed that since 1970, North America has lost about almost a third of the entire population of migratory songbirds. And this is a huge number. It's very concerning, and that is why the Partners Program is working in oak woodlands as these biodiversity hotspots to try to maintain what we can before these species are listed, before these species show further declines. What's even more concerning is that grassland bird species showed the most precipitous decline, with over 50% of their populations being reduced since 1970. Here's a slide just illustrating the importance of oaks in terms of providing the cavities in the acorn mass that wildlife depends on. Western gray squirrels, lots of woodpeckers, lots of songbirds, smaller mammals, nest and roost in the oak cavities that provide the acorn mass, particularly in the fall when food resources are scarce. Bear and deer and quail and bandtail pigeons and lots of other species depend on this acorn mass. The bottom picture shows on one of the project sites I worked on, we were walking past a big black oak and we found a black bear denning in the cavity at the base of the black oak. So that just illustrates that, you know, there's not very many trees that have cavities big enough for bear, but black oaks are one of them. We're trying to preserve these larger trees on the landscape. Another component, of course, is the understory, the native bunch grasses, the wildflowers that support pollinators, including butterflies and bumblebees and honeybees. And I am not an expert on grasses or bugs, but just pointing out, illustrating the importance that these habitats provide for all these critters, which goes up the food chain to birds, to mammals. So what's the problem? Well, the main problem here on the North Coast is conifer encroachment. I'm sure as most of you are aware. The process under fire exclusion by which native conifers increase and eventually replace deciduous oak woodlands. Cocking et al. Illustrated this well in this illustration at the bottom, that if there isn't a disturbance regime such as fire, or in our case, mechanical removal of conifers, that succession will march onward and the trees will eventually overtop and shade out and kill the oak woodlands. Shriver in 2015, in conjunction with UC Cooperative Extension, looked at 10 different sites across Humboldt County and cored the trees in these different plots and basically showed that the oaks were here first. If you look at the minimum age of oaks and the medium age of Douglas fir, this illustrates this point. This handy graph shows it even better. 1850 to 1900, most of the trees in the plots were Oregon white oak and California black oak, and it wasn't until fire suppression really took hold on the landscape from 1900s onward, you can see the transition to conifer forests. So this illustrates the point that the oaks were here first. What we're trying to do now is conserve the oaks that are remaining on the landscape. There's lots of larger, older oaks. There's not much oak regeneration, probably due to browse by native wildlife. So this first stage, before we can get prescribed burning on the landscape, is, I call it triage. We're just protecting what's on the landscape, removing the conifers that are encroaching, hoping we give the oaks enough time to eventually seed out and reproduce and maintain the landscape for another 50 years. So this is what it looks like on the ground. This is understory establishment. It moves to piercing the canopy. Here we have our forester, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, Matthew Cocking, looking very perturbed about what's going to happen to this black oak if it's not, the conifers aren't removed in the next 15 to 20 years. And here is the end result, which I see all over other different lands that I work on, is the overtopping and eventual death of the oaks. So this brings us back to private landowners and the Partners Program. Over 80% of our Oregon white oak and California black oak woodlands occur on private lands in California, and that's up to 87% in Humboldt County. Private landowners have seen a large decline in oak woodlands due to conifer encroachment, and most cite the lack of fire as the primary culprit. A lot of the ranchers I work with grew up burning, or actually their dads and their grandfathers grew up burning these habitats, and they noticed as soon as the fire stopped, the conifers came in. So now I'm going to talk about two examples of partners funded oak woodland projects that I've worked on in conjunction with landowners. This first one, Fort Baker Ranch Oak Woodland Project, was a collaboration between NRCS, the Partners Program, and the landowner. Phase one was implemented in 2016, over 100 acres, where we removed early Seral Douglas fir, and again in 2018 worked in partnership with NRCS to map and remove an additional 100 acres from identified work units. Here's an aerial of the phase 1 and phase 2 projects. So the way this worked was the forester, NRCS, and myself went out and basically mapped work units that showed encroachment. NRCS has to develop a cost per acre cost rate, so they have to do a stand inventory and look at size and density of trees and assign a cost rate to that. What I have to do in my program, I don't have to. I can use the NRCS cost rates, or I can go out and get bids from contractors, and then the landowner can choose a contractor he or she wishes to work with. And that's what we ended up doing on this project. We got a big hand labor crew that used chainsaw to essentially work in all these different identified work units, cut down the trees, put them into burn piles, and that was the partner's cost share. The landowner's cost share is to follow up and burn the burn piles or do a prescribed burn in the future. Here's just an example of the work plan that we developed for this particular project. The different work units, the numbers in there are the acreages. That's an example of NRCS that would develop different work units, have cost rates. Some were really dense, some were not so dense. And in my area on the pink, it was just one big work unit where I got bids from contractors. Here's some before and after photos from this project, as well as a few other oak woodland projects, just to give you a sense of what they look like immediately before and after treatment. Here's the before, here's the after. Again, early understory establishment before, after. Here we have a little more advanced stage of encroachment where the trees are piercing the canopy of the oak. So this is the before, and we have the after. One more photo montage. We have before. Immediately after, doesn't look so well. And then 1 year later, you can see that the oaks have responded well. The small, tiny oak in the middle is developing leaves all over its main stem. And I do not have a picture of several years after that, but native bunch grasses have moved in as a result of the landowner doing a prescribed burn. So project example number 2 is entitled Salmon Creek Native Grassland Restoration Project, and this is in southern Humboldt County, and this was a brainchild of the landowner Kyle Keegan, who took the bull by the horns, realized that this grassland was becoming encroached, and we partnered with him him and his wife Dana went out and collected native bunchgrass seed from the grassland, and he grew plugs and seeds from wildflowers and its champsia and California fescue and Idaho fescue and other bunch grasses and wildflowers, and removed the conifers, burned the piles, and then he went out and they planted the native grass plugs in the burn piles. Here's some photos of just the seeds he collected, the before and after of the conifer removal. And this was the first phase. We funded him again for a second phase for another 5 acres of work on this grassland. So pretty excited with the work he's done. The plugs have responded well so far, although we need a few years of rains to really see if they take hold. I just want to make note of the fact the native bunch grasses have a very long taproot, which show a reduced erosion as compared to the annual non-native grasses that typically dominate the grasslands these days. They also provide better wildlife cover and habitat for nesting songbirds and quail and other little critters that live in these grasslands. Which brings us back to why we are doing these projects, which are these grassland oak-associated birds. The bird on the left is an American kestrel. Kestrels have declined about 50% over the last 50 years across North America. Western bluebirds are oak obligate species. Kyle has not seen them on this grassland for 20 years. And then as soon as he did this project, both the bluebirds and a kestrel immediately came to this side of the grassland. And, you know, this illustrates that birds respond to structure, and it doesn't take much to improve the habitat value for them. I threw this slide in just as a plug for oak regeneration, that, you know, we see a lot of oak saplings on the landscape. We see a lot of oak seedlings on the landscape, but not a lot of saplings. And it's hard to know exactly why, but it's probably as a result of lots of native critters like deer and vole and rabbit browsing on them, cows sometimes, but everything is keying in on deciduous oaks. So we need to protect them. And I throw in a lot of my contracts is that the landowner can cage existing seedlings. And here's a couple examples of that. We've also had a few landowners who wanted to plant oaks. The picture on the left is up in Kneeland, and it's been about 8 years since we planted those oaks and been about a 50% survival rate, which is actually pretty good, better than I expected. And last, this brings us to the reason you guys are all here, which is prescribed fire is a long-term solution to conserving oak woodland ecosystems. And lucky for us, we have a UC Crawford extension, which has been very proactive, and they've been rock stars. They started a prescribed burn association, which allows local landowners and partners to conduct their own burns. And since its inception over the last few years, they've burned hundreds of acres of grasslands and oak woodlands, some of which have been a partners program funded sites. And you know, this is the long-term solution. The work that I'm doing, the woody biomass removal, is triage. We're trying to protect the oaks that are there now, but you know, long-term, the conifers will come back within 40 to 50 years and overtop these oaks. So there has to be a management plan in place, you know, rotation of prescribed fire. And you know, we're lucky enough up here to have people leading the way in that field. And that is the end of my talk. I would like to acknowledge Natural Resource Conservation Service. Matt Cocking, the oak ecologist, forester there, has been a leader in the field of oak restoration. I've learned a lot from him. Humboldt State University has conducted some very valuable research showing that the oaks were here first. UC Crawford Extension has been a leader in oak restoration and prescribed burning. And last, of course, the private landowners who have worked with the Partners Program, let us do these projects to benefit wildlife. Couldn't do it without them. They are the reason the wildlife are still out there on the landscape, and appreciate all the hard work they put in on these projects. Thank you very much.